All right, maybe we still have a few people joining, so we'll give it we'll wait till it slows down and then we'll get going. For those who have just joined, we'll get going here in just a second. As you might have noted or just heard, the meeting is going to be recorded, so we'll have a recording that we can share with folks later. I'll give it until 10:04 and then we'll get started. Okay, well, hello, good morning, everybody. Welcome. Thanks for coming. Thanks for taking some time out of your day to come talk cumulative impacts again with us here at PCA. For those who have just joined, please note that the meeting is going to be recorded. It is being recorded right now. Feel free if you have questions or comments, use the chat box, throw those in there. We'll get to them kind of as we go. We'll give you a quick summary of the meeting here, and then other folks from MPCA, if you could sort of keep an eye on the waiting room and let people in as they keep joining. There's still a few people joining as we're getting started. So I'm gonna pull up the presentation for today. And I believe if I could just get somebody to say, you're seeing the actual slides, not the presenter view, correct? All right,
Yes.
perfect.
Yep.
Perfect. Well, again, thanks everybody for being here today, taking your time. This is the first of two webinars. It is going to cover the same content. We're just providing an opportunity to chat at different times today and then tomorrow. Today in the afternoon or in the morning, and then tomorrow in the evening. My name's Hassan Boucherab. I'm an engineer in our air policy unit here at the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, coordinating this rulemaking, this overall effort. I apologize, bear with me. I have a little bit of a cold, so I might occasionally mute to cough or sneeze or something like that. I'm okay, but I'm just sharing my germs with only my cats at home. So for today, we're going to talk cumulative impacts. This is kind of our midpoint check-in. We're about a year and a half into, a little over that, a year and a half into the work on this rulemaking. And this rule, for today, what we're going to cover is sort of a summary, a kind of a preview, a review and a preview. You could think of this as like your last season on the cumulative impacts rulemaking. So we'll give you sort of, if you haven't been following along with this rule, this should give you a good starting point if you want to hop in and participate more, or if you're interested in participating more, this should give you a good starting point. Because we're going to cover some of the rule basics, the process, the applicability. We'll do a look back at what's happened, and we'll do a look forward into 2025 and beyond. So if you have been following along, some of this might feel more like review, which is okay. I think this is a helpful thing regardless. You might have some different perspectives that you want to share with us as well. So what we'll cover beyond just sort of the quick basics, we'll kind of skim through that pretty quickly. But from there, we'll give you a look back at what we've done over the last year and a half, kind of looking at the 2023 request for comments when we got this rulemaking started, all of the different efforts that we had going on during 2024, and then we'll head into 2025. So what does this look like? Folks have asked us, hey, what does engagement, what do meetings and other opportunities look like coming up this year? So we'll give you a little preview of that. We'll talk about a little bit where we are with the concepts and kind of what we're working on developing for this rule. And then we'll give you a really high level preview of the formal rulemaking steps that's going to happen in 2026. Um, so with that, let's talk the rule process, the basics, and applicability. So this is going to be a lot of the general information for folks. So what we have, if you haven't found this, or if you got to this meeting in a different way than our mailing list, well done. I would encourage you to sign up for that. We have a whole rule webpage where you can find not only this rule, but all of the other rules that MPCA is working on, whether it's air, land, water. And you can sign up to receive emails of interest for any of those rules. So if you're interested, highly encourage you or anybody else you might think is interested as well to go to that webpage or follow that QR code. And you can find there's a little box that says sign up, and all you have to do is enter your email. We have the specific webpage for cumulative impacts there, and that's where we're going to post all of the various rulemaking. Sorry, go ahead. Or somebody, if you could mute unless you have a question. Thank you. Um, so we post all of the various rulemaking documents there, like the comments we've received during that initial request for comments, the meeting materials that we've done in the webinars or the working sessions so far, summary documents, all sorts of things we post there. And you can also find links to the previous, to the recordings of previous webinars and our summaries that we put together of those work sessions. So that is where eventually I think the recording of this webinar will might live, or you can also find that on the MPCA's YouTube channel. So if you aren't familiar with the rule process, this is a really high level overview. So kind of from start to finish, what does this all look like? And I wanted to highlight for folks where in blue, where are those opportunities for public participation? So a rule will start with that request for comments. This is what we did about a year and a half ago. We didn't have a whole lot of information to share at that point because those little asterisks around that is we had a 60-day deadline from when the law was passed that authorized this rule to get that request for comments out. But from there, we've had, and many rules will have informational or public meetings. We'll go through the whole process of actually creating the rules and the statement of need and reasonableness. Basically, that document is the justification for the rules. We'll get to the proposed rules where that public comment is, or the very technical term is notice of intent to adopt. Again, we have a deadline. That's one where we have a deadline specified that we have to get to for this rulemaking. And then for this rulemaking in particular, we are planning on doing a public hearing that is in front of an administrative law judge. It's a very formal process. There will be opportunities to comment at the hearing and during the post-hearing comment period. But from there, just the kind of the last steps is we'll respond to those comments. There will be an order adopting rules that goes and a bunch of other rulemaking documents that goes up through the MPCA to the governor's office. They get a chance to review everything. The Office of Administrative Hearings reviews and approves or disapproves pieces or parts of the rule before the rule is finally published, which is the final rule that then would govern what happens. What does this regulatory program actually do? So let's back up. This rule, hey, all got started due to the advocacy efforts of a wide variety of people. So kudos to those who helped make this rulemaking happen, because it's without those advocacy efforts, this rule we wouldn't necessarily be doing this rule. What this rule is generally going to cover is Minnesotans' disproportionate exposure to pollutants. So we're looking at environmental justice areas and doing more in those areas. There are some specifics that this isn't a all-encompassing program. It applies in some cases, and it applies here in when there is a certain air permit application in environmental justice areas in parts of Minnesota. And What we have to work with is an outline that the legislature gave us. They gave us some of the directions, but they tasked MPCA with defining and establishing a lot of the different parts of the rule, and they gave us that deadline to get to that notice of intent to adopt, excuse me, from about 36 months or roughly May 2026. So, where does this apply? This applies in environmental justice areas, plus a 1 mile buffer around those areas in the Twin Cities 7 county metro, and a city or cities of the first class, which is a legislative term, generally referring to cities with 100,000 people or more, as recorded in the most recent census, which is currently Rochester and Duluth, that are cities outside of the 7 county metro. The rules apply only to major, or sometimes you'll might hear PCA refer to this as Title V or Part 70, plus state permit applications for air emissions permits. It includes new facilities, facility expansions, and when we are reissuing an expiring permit for an existing facility. If you want to see sort of our first guess at those facilities that might be affected, and this isn't a conclusive list, well, the rules are still being written, so everybody will still have to figure out at the end of the day who does this apply. But our sort of tentative list that we put together, you can find on our webpage as well. Um, excuse me. So when we say environmental justice areas, what do we mean? This is a definition that the legislature included, and it's basically one of 4 categories. You don't have to be all of these, but you can be any of these to be classified as an environmental justice area under this definition. So 40% or more of the population is non-white. 35% or more of households have an income at or below 200% of the federal poverty levels, which is roughly $60,000 for a family of 4. 40% or more of the population over the age of 5 has limited English proficiency, or it's located within Indian country, which is which is defined in U.S. code. So you can see sort of these areas exist around Minnesota, across the state. But again, this rule is focused on the 7 county metro, Duluth, and Rochester. So if we kind of dive into that a little, sort of zoom in a little bit, this is kind of what that looks like. So you can see there's a fair bit of environmental justice areas around the Twin Cities themselves, but there's other little areas as well, as far down as some of the southern suburbs, northern suburbs, outer ring. And then same idea when we look at Duluth and Rochester, you can kind of see where those areas exist, for one of these criterias. So this map is just simplified. We're not distinguishing here, which criteria it was, other than is it an environmental justice area or not. And as we've been talking about this, and kind of the big overview that we've used in a lot of meetings so far, is here's what we have to create. We have about 8 different big pieces. The first 2 are just the applicability, which we don't have much to do there. The legislature was pretty specific. But then you can see for the last 6, there is a whole host of information and decision points that the legislature left up to the MPCA to create, the which we'll talk about in a little bit more detail, as we go. So we have a lot to do, and that's what we've been talking about the last year and a half, and we still are going to be talking about those moving forward. I'm going to pause there, just see, did we have any questions in the chat? Looks like they've all been addressed. Thank you. Okay, so let's go into what happened last season on cumulative impacts. So thank you. First and foremost, thank you, because you all have put a lot of time and effort into participating. whether it was through comment letters, through attending webinars or work sessions or other meetings, or just even conversations, emailing me, talking to somebody else, talking after the end of one of these meetings, the amount of time and effort that people have put into this uh, is just amazing. It's great. So what this webinar is and kind of what our focus here today is to kind of show you, we want to highlight how your feedback has influenced the process so far. This is a little different than what we've been doing or how we do like a usual quote unquote rulemaking. Um, People wanted to be involved and help follow along, create the process as we're going. Um, which has been, frustrating in some cases because, but also enjoyable in other cases because somebody might have expected, I thought you would have had a little bit more information at this meeting. Well, that comes with the territory of working on things together and starting early in the process. So I hope it's been more enjoyable than frustrating. If it has, please let me know so we can try and figure out how to do better in the future as well. But so again, we're going to highlight your feedback and kind of show you how the ideas we've been working on and talking with you about have grown over time in relation to those ideas. Um, so what have we done? You might have seen, if you've been at any of these meetings before, you've probably seen this graphic a handful of times. Where are we now? Halfway through that process. We had 5 different meetings in 2023. We had a ton of different webinars and meetings, basically about one a month in 2024, where we're talking about all of those little areas to create and think about. And we still have about half of the process left. So we'll get to actually proposing some draft rules, which will be available for review. And, after that, we'll get to the adoption and implementation. So let's start back in with the request for comments. So, like I mentioned, this was pretty general because we had to get this out within that 60 days after the law was signed or the bill was signed into law. Um, we got a ton of turnout. We got almost 360 different comment letters across those five, excuse me, across those 5 public meetings and during that comment period. Um, we gave so you know some of these were from individuals, some of these were from regulated parties or consultants or community groups, advocacy groups, environmental business. So again, this is a rule that has garnered a lot of interest, and again, thank you for giving us those comments, especially at an early stage like that where we essentially said, here's what the legislature told us to do, what do you think, was about the extent of the questions we had. So we started pretty broad, and we shared back in November 23. We shared sort of our summary of the comments that we had received, and from there, that's where we sort of previewed what we were going to do next, leading into those co-learning webinars that I'll talk about in a little bit, and some of the working sessions as well. So, big picture, what did we see here from that request for comments? You all emphasized, hey, outreach, engagement, accessibility, transparency, and like, how are you making decisions? Make sure you're being transparent, make sure you're being clear, make sure you're explaining what we're doing. And I think that was one of the loudest themes from those comments was MPCA, we want you to do more as far as outreach and engagement goes. So we listened and we hope you liked it. We tried a lot of new things, including those co-learning webinars and working sessions. Um, there was a request to make summaries of all of those meetings, for that outreach and engagement effort, doing summaries. So, hey, I might not have been able to attend, but I still care. I still want to follow along with the process. Um, and we did get a handful of suggestions on specific parts of the rule as well, even as broad as the question as we did ask. Um, a couple things I wanted to highlight and that we highlighted previously was, hey, for this cumulative impact analysis, make it accessible, make it understandable, because this is something that the public, community, a neighborhood, they might be particularly invested, especially if it involves their neighborhood, their community. Um, a lot of examples or suggestions of, hey, can you follow existing work that you do already? Do you follow along something like the environmental review process or other processes that you do? And then community benefit agreements. This was another area that was really high interest for folks. People were really interested in this, and specifically, you know, who to involve, who is a part of these agreements, what do they include, how do we make sure everybody is accountable to whatever ends up in those agreements. So there was a ton of information that everybody shared with us in this request for comments that I mean, like I said, we had a whole webinar to summarize it. So this is just a or just sort of a quick reminder. We've certainly expanded on these ideas moving forward, but if you're curious to see what we thought back then, I would encourage you go check out that November webinar. So, like I said, in that request for comments, you gave us a lot of ideas, and we tried to expand on those. We tried to address those as best we could, where we did like I said, about a different one meeting a month, whether it was a webinar or a work session. Um, the co-learning webinars started first. These webinars, we brought in folks from other states, other parts of the country to talk about and share their experience and how they've implemented similar rules or worked on similar aspects of something that might make its way into this program. So the whole point here was to think about, how has somebody else done this? How can we apply that here in Minnesota? How can we sort of tailor what maybe somebody else has done in a similar way? Because it's always easier to think about, how do you edit something instead of creating something brand new? So, and we tried to then expand on that even more in those work sessions. So we'll get into the details of all of these, but the work sessions were then talking about, let's take a little bit more detailed look at an area. So this is where we started, MPCA started talking about what we're seeing, what we're thinking about, what we've been hearing, what we've been putting together based on input from the webinars, from our own research, from you, from commenters, from conversations, and we brought in some outside help. A group, we had DeYoung Consulting help us out with those meetings to help do some facilitation and help do some good discussion on these areas. So these meetings were really like the sausage making, if you will, of let's think about this. How are we going to think about the contents of a community benefit agreement? What does a cumulative impacts analysis cover? What does it look like or look at? Um, and those work sessions were really what we tried to do is focus on, here's what the legislature told us we need to cover in the program. How can we take what we've learned from others and the time and effort that you all and others have put into this to get us here? So again, I really trying to emphasize here, we're doing our best to try and bring you along in the process, as well as make sure you feel like we are hearing you in this rule. So let's talk about the co-learning webinars. If you want to go see these, you can see recordings. Again, we have these up on our YouTube page. Um, we had these in January, March, and April, and it's down the list as you go. So we heard from New Jersey, from their version. They have a very similar program in New Jersey that they're maybe a couple years ahead of where Minnesota is right now in the. So we heard from them. We heard from programs in Colorado and Washington, D.C. in March about the data gathering and the type of analysis that they do for their similar programs. And then in April, we brought in some folks who have talked about not necessarily exactly community benefit agreements, but how similar community-centered agreements were developed and worked on in places like Flint, Michigan, and how one group in particular helps other companies, other development projects think about community centered and local centered benefits as part of the design of their process. And then from there, transitioning sort of from those co-learning webinars, we gave, here's where we think we are in the rule, a preview of the work sessions in May. And this included basically our walkthrough of a little bit more detail on what we think we need to include in the rule, what we need to come up with. And then the whole point here was to help shift from looking at other examples to starting to think about how can we build on those? How can we revise those to make it make sense here in Minnesota? I thought these webinars went really well. We averaged about 100 people in each webinar, which is great. That's an amazing turnout for a rule. That's wonderful. There was tons of conversation and questions, and it really did help. It gave us a lot of areas to think about in more detail, like what are the environmental stressors? What are the things that we should look at in a cumulative impacts analysis? What are those that are important to Minnesota? How do we involve people both during this process, during this rulemaking, and in the process afterwards? And how do we think about something like lived experience, where this isn't necessarily numbers, right? It's not a data set. It's my experience living here in the Twin Cities Metro, living in Duluth or Rochester. How do we incorporate that type of information where possible into this rule? So this really informed all of like what we wanted to talk about in these work sessions in a little bit more detail. Um, so these were held from July to November. We had 5 in-person meetings once a month. This was sort of spread around Duluth, Rochester, and the Twin Cities. The whole idea here was to hopefully have meaningful discussion with people that showed up, with the participants. Our goal was to try and our goal in sharing with folks was that you all understood and people who attended the meetings understood how the information, the feedback, your thoughts that you gave us will be used in sort of working to create and refine the different parts of this rule. Uh, because these were in person, it did require a little bit more travel, and it wasn't really a big presentation. So it wasn't something like this where it was a longer presentation with questions and things like that. It was a very short presentation, and then there was lots of smaller group discussions. So we didn't want to cut anybody out of the process. So we did offer sort of an informal comment period. So if you weren't able to attend or you wanted to provide written comments in addition to something you did say at the meeting, if you did attend, you could provide that there as well. And we had a handful of folks choose that option. I think roughly 5 to 8 different comment letters came in for each of these work sessions. And all of those materials and comments, you can again find those on our webpage too. So we talked at these work sessions generally about data, community benefit agreements, and the benchmarks. Um, Still good attendance, roughly 20 to 60 people at each session. Um, with a specific note here that we'll talk about a little bit later. I'll come back to this, but about I think we did a rough estimate at those meetings. It was about 2/3 of people at those meetings were there because of a professional interest. So they were either, a consultant, regulated party, somebody whose time was, this was maybe part of their job to be there. Um, but I'll touch on that a little bit later. And I think I found these really helpful, and I think at least the folks I talked to after meetings and things like that as well, I think everybody found this pretty helpful. Pretty good discussion. It really helped get into the details and think about what are the different parts here. I'm going to pause for just a sec, see some. Oh, perfect. Yes, and I think I've seen some questions in there and some comments. Great. Perfect. So let's talk, we'll kind of briefly talk about each of these work sessions and kind of what we heard and where this made an impact. So in July, we talked about data and indicators or those environmental stressors. This was sort of our first meeting. This was, I think, the highest attendance one. This was great. Um, we really wanted to think about the data that we could include and how to narrow it down because there's lots of data out there, but how do you choose which things to look at? You can't look at everything. Um, so we kind of focused on, where have we seen input in the past? Not just on this rule, but in what people have told MPCA in the past on different issues, different concerns. We really thought about what what did we hear from that co-learning webinar where we heard about New Jersey's environmental justice tool. And then thinking about, we have a lot of data-minded folks here, so how do we rely on and use their expertise and experience to help us fill this out? So what we heard in general was that people agreed. We brought a bunch of categories, a bunch of different data that we could include, but there was sort of a desire and a want for more detail to better understand what data is included. Um, so we certainly could. Um, we had ideas of all of the different types of things that we could include, um, but folks wanted to know a little bit more about how we chose to narrow down. So that was one output that we'll talk about for in the next work session for data. But people were also concerned about, not just data, but what are the other neighborhood or pollution concerns? Things like, because this was the first meeting, there was lots of conversation, lots of topics, but like, how do you bring community into the process? How do you define community? Um, Everybody's definition of community might be a little different. Your definition of your neighborhood and your community is probably different than the next person's. Um, so talking about things like that, concerns about issues like non-expiring permits and how they could potentially be addressed, and then requests for meeting materials and recordings. So, again, getting feedback at that meeting and changing kind of what we're doing on the fly as well, um, to try and listen to you all and be responsive and be responsive to the information and comments that you're sharing with us. So, August, this was our first meeting on community benefit agreements. Again, we shared our ideas surrounding what those could look like, the different types of benefits or categories. We were tasked with creating the content and process for entering into a community benefit agreement and what else is included as part of that. So, again, we kind of drew on those examples that we learned from the webinars. We did a lot of research based into what MPCA has done and what other states have done or included in similar agreements. Big picture takeaway here is, again, people generally supported the types of benefits that were suggested, but there was a big want for and need for different types of engagement, methods. So not just one platform or one methodology. Give us, different formats, different languages, media platforms, all sorts of different ways to reach different community members. So sharing resources in advance because, there was sort of this expressed lack of knowledge, of technical knowledge. So for things like CBA meetings or negotiations, having additional support for resources, additional support for community for resources was a big theme here. So how do we also then thinking about, moving forward and examples of like how can we bring other people, how do you, if you're using different methods, can you also bring in different groups or different ways to do that? Support, for example, different for a community might be like, hey, here's a clearinghouse of different benefits. Maybe this is what other people have done or other groups have done. So we can have something to look at as an example. And then kind of the last thing to touch on here was there are some big concerns in trust in drafting and approving a CBA. Again, really just kind of re-emphasizing that transparency and accessibility side of things. Lots of suggestions about sort of the process of who is included, how does drafting the agreement work, are different community groups, local officials, public health groups, youth groups, local business. There's, a whole ton of different suggestions of people that could be included. Um, Ideas of like other concerns, other things that are um, that matter here. How do we get appropriate representation of the community for a community benefit agreement? Um, this is all something we don't have an answer for right now, but I think we're hoping to show you that we're thinking about this kind of stuff and it's making its way into what we're thinking about. So, and there were other concerns too about like, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you
Okay.
now.
Yeah. So how like and other the last bit here was, what does a successful, what does the end of this look like? There were other certainly interests too from not just community, but from the regulated parties in the group of like what what's the bar? And it's a reasonable question to ask how much, has to go into a community benefit agreement. So these are all things that we're thinking about and that will hopefully make it, we'll figure out a way to make this into the rule. So September, we talked benchmarks. So this was kind of the question of when is a cumulative impacts analysis required? And we kind of broke this up into two ways. There's some parts of the statutes that say MPCA must require, and so we kind of referred to those as the mandatory. And then there is a different part of the rule or the statute that says MPCA may require, and that's the discretionary side of things. So again, we kind of looked to the examples that we had, whether it was in New Jersey or here in Minnesota, we have a handful of different rule thresholds that were used in air permitting, in environmental review. There were examples of discretionary analyses, both from environmental review and, in our some additional work that we do, like our air emissions risk analysis. And we also had that petition process as part of environmental review as well. So um, this was kind of a big question. I think the 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 big point here was people really found it hard to weigh in on, which side is mandatory versus which side is discretionary without describing the other option or without knowing the other option. Fair. Like we certainly felt that way too. So trying to think about both sides of the question is is not necessarily easy. But we did get suggestions to focus on, a handful of different things, like focus on those social, economic, community-based, health or environmental factors. And the good note here is there was a lot of crossover between what people thought would be important for a mandatory or a discretionary side of things. So kind of, I remember the conversation at that night being, well, if it doesn't make it into one, maybe it'll seems pretty good if it showed up in both, it'll make it into one or the other. So we're still weighing all of that. But there was other good suggestions too of do we how do we weigh a bunch of different information? So if we're thinking on like economic or the health or environmental factors, is there, um, do we sort of focus first on time and effort into lowering pollution emissions before requiring a cumulative impacts analysis. So do we set, a threshold or a benchmark that is based on emissions, that if somebody isn't increasing emissions or is lowering emissions, that an analysis isn't necessarily required. Um, and there was lots of suggestions of, again, like, how do we compare? Do we compare to, you know, what an area is experiencing in particular? Do we compare to like the county, to the state average? Do we think about it sort of that way? Um, and then how do we also, this was one area where that idea of lived experience um, was a big question, because especially for the petition process, um, that's kind of an opportunity for uh, members of a community to ask MPCA, hey, we think you should require this facility to do a cumulative impacts analysis, and here's the reasons why. Um, and that might be a really good area or a really relevant area to think about how can lived experience be a part of that. That was definitely a theme both in the initial request for comments and in some of these meetings was my community might not be a bunch of technically minded folks. How can you make this accessible to us where we don't necessarily need to write a research paper for a petition to be successful? So we've been thinking about that. We've been talking with a lot of different groups about that idea as well, especially with EPA, trying to think about lived experience and how that can make its way into a bunch of different efforts. So we're nearing the end of our work sessions. We did a follow-up on community benefit agreements because this was a topic where there was so much discussion, and we thought it would be good to do a second one of these. So we talked in more specific detail about some topics that people had lots of questions about. Um, so kind of immediate feedback of, you wanted to talk about this more? Perfect, let's talk about it more. So we talked a little bit more about the types of benefits, those categories that we could include. We talked about like what's a community's role in the CBA, and talking a little bit about some of the outreach and public meeting requirements. And one of the big parts here was focusing on how do we really get that good community engagement, and how can communities provide input on a CBA. So good news is when we came back to this, a couple months, the first one being in August. Um, we heard a lot of some of the same things, very close along what we've heard at previous work sessions. Again, multiple communication methods, different ways to do public meetings or notices. Um, but there is a lot of caution here as well, because we talked about some examples of like other places around the country, like the city of Detroit, had a neighborhood advisory council that they used to help think through their community benefit ordinance. Um, there was a lot of concerns expressed about that idea on all sides. Like, how do you decide who's a part of that? Who gets to say that the people there represent the community? And it's kind of, that's a really relevant question and a really hard question of like how do you choose people, and how do you really think about this in a way of making sure you're trying to get enough representation, and set this up in a way that is, this could be done in anywhere around the 7 county metro, Duluth or Rochester. So it's not like we can just pick one setting. We have to have something that's set up to work across the state. Um, And that kind of made its way into other things too, because there were suggestions about using maybe existing community groups, but people didn't necessarily weren't fans of that either. They're like, well, that might not make the process go all that fast. It might not represent the full community. Um, but I think the big picture here is there was a preference for more opportunities for input. So regardless of the methodology, whether it was a council meeting or something different. We just want more opportunities for input than just a public notice or just a public meeting necessarily. So we're working on that. We're trying to think about what we could do there. Um, and then we talked a little bit about just to round out this session, we talked about different benefits and the categories and how we might prioritize that. That was a big question of like, well, how do we tie things? How do we get to the issues of importance for this community or for this area in particular? So we talked a little bit about, ideas of, how do we prioritize that kind of stuff? Do we maybe focus on the things that a facility is directly impacting first, and then sort of go from there? Maybe there's the direct impacts from the facility and then sort of more indirect impacts and beyond. So lots of questions, lots of things to think about there as well. And then our last work session just a few months ago here in November, we again brought back the data and indicators. So this was sort of a long step between the first one back in July and this last one in November. We discussed a lot more detail about the specific topics. Folks really wanted more detail, so we shared where we were at. Back in July, we had about 100 different data sets that we could potentially include, and we kind of split those up into our yes, no, and maybe piles. So we gave a lot of information, a little short packet about kind of here's why we think these things are in either of these piles or likely to be included or not. And we had a little poster board where people could speak with your dots and kind of help us figure out, hey, we had the yes pile. Do you think anything that's in here really shouldn't be in here? We had the no pile. Do you think something in there should actually be in here? And then we had the maybe, where we just had people help us understand which of these might you have a preference over. So there were a ton of concerns here that were brought up as well. Lots of conversation and question. Um, there were, what happens if data isn't available in the future? Very, very reasonable question. We're thinking about that right now, and we're seeing that right now with some of the examples that we've looked to in the past no longer being available. Like EPA's EJ screen. So that's something we'll have to consider and be cognizant of as we move forward. Um, there were questions too about like, hey, are we only looking at the negative impacts? Can we also look at the positive side of things? So, you know, is it all just a negative look, or are we looking at um, something that might happen, such as like we're adding more trees to the area, so there's additional tree canopy and it'll help out some of that um, green space around the neighborhood. So, and then really, how do we think about avoiding silos? So we don't want to get too specific that we're looking at the cumulative impacts here. How do we think across those interactions between different data? And then big picture, really, when we're looking at this data, and we'll get into this here in just a second, but when we're looking at this data, this might be like a good basis or a good chunk of what looking at a cumulative impacts analysis, what that analysis actually looks at. So if we're looking at this data, how do communities, how do facilities, how does MPCA act on that information? What does that actually, what could we do with it? And how do we bring the different perspectives of what we could do with it into the process? So we're planning on maybe sharing a little bit more about that in the future, which I'll get to in just a second. We're almost to the 2025 preview. So now let's talk a little bit about, that was a lot. So I'm going to take a quick pause and look at the chat here. Let's see. I think looks like there was a question about the link to the YouTube page that I think I saw the link was posted. Somebody asked, why did we use New Jersey? Um, yeah, good question. New Jersey is a uh, the example that's probably most close to both what we're tasked with creating and is the example that I think a lot of the advocates that were working on this bill had in mind or were looking at when they were helping think through the bill that ultimately became law. So I'll talk just to quickly answer some of these things as we go through, but we'll save the more discussion for the end. Um, there's some suggestions for how to incorporate human people's experiences. Thanks, Nahid. Some reports. Um, Suggestions to include reviewing highway and freeway projects, working with MnDOT. Oh, and I see Alexa has recorded those. Great. Um, CMEJ says no carbon credits, it's fraud. I don't think we're thinking about carbon credits. We're more just talking about the prevalence, the how much green space is there, and kind of what that looks like. I think that came up. I saw that come up around the time I was talking about tree canopy. But um, CMEJ, if you want to expand on that a little bit later, I would happily we can happily do that. So. Where we're going. So I kind of thinking about this, what I wanted to share with you all was um, kind of three bigger areas. So when is that analysis required? Thinking about the benchmarks and the petition process. We'll talk about this data app because that's what we've been talking about in some of these working sessions and kind of what New Jersey has as well is a really slick tool that makes it easy to understand. Here's all the data. Here's what we're seeing for this area, and here's how it compares to the county or to the state. And then we'll talk a little bit more about community benefit agreements, the process and content, and some of the outreach and community participation. So when we're talking about when is an analysis required, um, we're talking about these two pieces that the legislature gave us circled in red. So we kind of have the benchmarks, which are that mandatory side, and then we have the petition process, which is part of the discretionary side. So, and before I go on, the one bit here that I want to highlight is under that petition process, um, you know, one part of this is there needs to be, and these are the words from the statutes, material evidence that supports it. So it we have to have something, we have to have a reason to require an analysis that comes in as part of that petition. So let's think about the benchmarks first, and then we'll talk about the petition process. So big picture, what we heard from you all and what we're kind of working towards now is clear expectations. So make it really easy to understand when is an analysis required? When is it mandatory? When is it discretionary? Folks liked the comparison to examples of other tools and other rules that are in existence. That makes it a little easier to understand, even if we don't know exactly what it looks like for Minnesota. If it looks something like New Jersey or something like a different example, that's a little easier to think about and figure out, do I like this? Do I not? What kind of questions, what kind of suggestions do I have? And then really focusing on the projects, the facility types, the changes that happen that have the potential for greatest impact. Um, we heard, we don't want necessarily like I only have a limited amount of time. Um, I want to know about the things that are going to have the biggest impacts potentially. I don't want to necessarily have this be the collection of everything or every small change necessarily. And there were other ideas too of, again, going back to that idea from a work session of, hey, maybe the emphasis here is let's focus first on lowering pollutant emissions before requiring an analysis. Um, the general idea being if we can prevent the pollution from occurring in the first place, that seems like a better outcome than, you know, reducing or mitigating the impacts after the pollution is emitted. There's ideas of like, how do we think about different vulnerable groups? So, during these work sessions and webinars, people were like, well, hey, what if there's a daycare or a school or something like that where there's, a higher number of people that are in a vulnerable group, like children or the elderly or people with respiratory illnesses, things like that. Um, and big picture here too, like again, going back to that community request for support, how can MPCA provide, some data or tools or things like that that could assist in gathering that material evidence that would go into something like a petition. So community can still put a petition together, but MPCA can have something available for people to look at. So now when we talk about the petition process and material evidence in more detail, um, their big picture, there was a lot of concerns about the process for collecting signatures. So this is one area where the legislature was specific. They said the petition has to be signed by 100 people who reside or own property in the impacted environmental justice area. Um, there were questions like, can the signatures be collected digitally? Um, what about people who work in that area but don't reside or own property there? So these are some areas, again, these are good questions, good comments. For the example of, what about people who just work there or who spend a lot of time but don't or own property or reside in the area? That's one area where, we can't do anything about that as part of this rulemaking. The legislature was specific about here's the bounds for some parts of this rule. But as a counterpoint, what qualifies as material evidence? There isn't something like that. So this is where we're looking at what what all should be included in there. What do we think about? How can we incorporate something like lived experience into material evidence? Um, So, and then a lot of requests or suggestions that, hey, MPCA, when a petition comes in, um, don't look at just that information, but do additional fact finding, sort of. So look at that evidence that we gave you, and use that in combination with your other expertise to decide, is a cumulative impacts analysis warranted here? So other questions, other ideas, what is the impacted environmental justice area? This is something that isn't defined in the statute. And so this is something that we're trying to think about. Is this just the census tract that the facility is located in, or they're within that 1 mile buffer of? Is it something else? Like, how do you decide what that impacted area is? And also have that available for, this is a petition process. So this might be early on in the process. So how do you know what that area is? So again, still thinking about that, but it was a good question. We've had that question too, and we're trying to think about that as we go. So I talked a little bit about like, what about people who don't live in the area? Can they sign the petition? At least according to the statutes, I don't believe so. But then other, good suggestions here, unique suggestions of like, hey, do you involve the MPCA's Environmental Justice Advisory Group in thinking about a petition? Do we bring them into the sort of that process? So now when we think about the analysis itself, we're looking at, the analysis, and we're trying to decide, when is there that substantial adverse impact? So a big piece of this is that app that we've been talking about. So this would be collecting all of that different data that we've been talking about, and we're working on creating that. and we're working on creating something to share with communities, with interested parties as we go. So where we are now from that, initial list of 100 that was whittled down to about 50, we have 18, do we think, that we feel pretty good about. This is data that's included in other data tools, so we have good examples to look at. We have access to high quality statewide data for the different stressors. It's a pretty even coverage across different themes, and there was a lot of community support for these, either in working sessions or public comments. So what that looks like, just so you can get sort of the preview here, is a handful of different types of data that might go into this tool, whether it's air pollution, land, or water pollution, whether it's public health related or social factors. Is it related to transportation? Is it related to, what's the neighborhood look like? What's the neighborhood environment? Things like food insecurity. But this isn't the whole list. We're thinking about, and kind of um, what we're thinking about is we're looking at about 10 other things. So, we only had one in that neighborhood environment, but we had, five, four in some other categories. Is there different things we want to include um, for neighborhood? Is there different social factors that we want to include? Is there different water pollution that we want to include? Um, we think we could probably include these. We've seen them in other tools as well. We have a pretty good basis to include them, but maybe some things that are holding these back that we're thinking about is, there was less interest or less support in them. Maybe there's not as direct or of a connection to public health from some of these. Maybe other indicators, other data sets capture the same idea. Um, and then, back to what we talked about previously is there might be some data quality, or we might just not have access, or, there's logistical challenges here as well. So all that in mind, we get through the cumulative impacts analysis. Maybe somebody has to do, not everybody, because there has to be that substantial adverse impact, but we get to the community benefit agreement. What does this look like? So let's talk a little bit about the content and process and kind of what we've been hearing. So we have a big picture, again, transparency. Like, make this transparent, both from MPCA, from regulated parties. Um, Again, re-emphasizing there's lots of opinions on who represents a community. And what are those opportunities for input beyond just a public comment period? Um, we have some other ideas to work with of, different methods for engagement and sharing information. Um, People were generally supportive of the categories and types of benefits, but they didn't necessarily want it to be, a well-defined list, right? Which I think makes sense because the specifics of each situation are going to be unique. So do you necessarily have a list, or um, you don't want to be restricted to just that? You don't want to, and you don't want to have, a ton of options that's too much to think of and too much to make a decision from. So, and then when we think about those, what is, how do we decide, is there a preference for the type of benefit? Is it, maybe there's a general preference for things that are tangible, um, that are tied to the impact that the facility is having, and then thinking about how do we get to a point that, what is enough? What's the end point? How do you know you're at a good end for disagreement in the conversation? So almost done, and then plenty of time for questions at the end here. We'll breeze through some of this stuff. Um, what is the future look like? So, 2024 was really focused on communication, outreach, and engagement. We were both tasked by the legislature, and you all told us you wanted us to do more than the usual rulemaking. So I think we did. we could, and we really focused on trying to learn alongside you, sharing where we were in the process, and trying to bring you along as much as possible um, throughout the process. So we're still going to be doing communications and engagement in 2025, but it might not look just like 2024. Um, we still want to continue that approach of like we have something new to share, so let's share it, and sharing those details as we go. Um, but we also want to try and reach more people where they are at. So like I mentioned, some of these work sessions were about 2/3 people in professional capacity. Uh, and we have a new group here at PCA that's been doing a lot of community outreach and engagement activities, specifically surrounding this rule, but as well as in general. Um, and so we're doing a lot. That group is doing a fantastic job of trying to just go to a bunch of different community events over time. We've gone to things like um, the statewide Martin Luther King conference that happened a little while ago, different like school district family nights, that kind of thing, where we just have a table and we're here to talk about cumulative impacts and talk about other MPCA work. So we're trying, we know that these meetings don't necessarily work the best for everybody. So we're trying to switch that up as well and try and talk to people who maybe don't know that this is going on, but are still would care if they did know it was going on. So what's going to happen over this next year? Continuing to work on those concepts, right? We have to put all of these pieces together, not just these individual little ideas, but how do we put this all into one, excuse me, how do we put this all into one cohesive program? So a lot of that's going to be figuring out the details. What do we include in each topic? More specifics. Um, and sort of the one of the things that we know I think a lot of people are going to be interested about is the different stressors that could be included in the tool, because this is going to both help answer when is an analysis required and help inform um, what that analysis looks at. So some of these ideas maybe to think about, when we're looking at that analysis, um, do we do the positive and negative impacts? What are the ways to reduce or mitigate or eliminate? Do we use in that analysis existing tools that we have? Do we use our air emissions risk analysis? Do we do modeling for air standards if it's like an if there's like a PM25 or different pollutant note that we can model for? When we think about that substantial adverse impact, I think I saw a question come through in the chat about this. How do we, it's a great question. How do we combine the impacts of a permit with the stressors and the socioeconomic impact of the facility to the residents? It's a tough question. Do we do some comparison? Again, kind of relying on what does the rest of the county look like? What does the rest of the state look like? If we use something like the air emissions risk analysis, do we use inhalation health benchmarks to look at cancer risk or chronic risk? Um, when we look at community benefit agreements, how do we decide the possible benefits and what to include? Do we compare to impacts? Um, Again, really thinking about what's that active outreach to for significant community participation. How do we be specific, but also recognize the unique circumstances? So we hope to get at some of those questions and some of those ideas in different events. This is what I was mentioning, doing different things like tabling or interviews or focus groups, attending existing events that are going on. A couple weeks back, we attended that Minneapolis Community Connections Conference. I mentioned the MLK Statewide Conference. Spring 2025. So this will be TBD, but like we're generally thinking about, do we have additional informational meetings, webinars, work sessions, maybe as we're thinking through a topic. Um, there might be more to talk about that we want to do something like this, whatever it looks like. And then summer and fall, We hope to have more potential meetings, webinars. Maybe we'll share sort of an informal comment period on rule concepts. So we'll get that big picture. What does this program look like from start to finish to give you something a little bit more to think about as a concept. That won't be rule language. It'll just be a, what do you think about this? Last couple of things. So what happens in 2026? May 2026 is when we get to that notice of intent to adopt. This is when you'll get to see actual rule language and the well thought out supporting justification written up and all of the extra details that really gives you the I's dotted and T's crossed type of explanation for why we're doing what we are proposing. That's the start of a very formal process. The rules and justification will be published in the state register. That starts the comment and notice period. As I mentioned, it will go to a public hearing where the administrative law judge will review our work and make sure we've dotted all the I's and crossed the T's. And then at the end of that, this is just the proposed rule, right? Both the public notice and the public hearings certainly could lead to changes in the rule that we publish in May versus the final version of the rule. But I think that is certainly intended. That's the whole point of a public comment period, is to suggest changes, and maybe changes happen. So speaking of, last slide, and then I'll stop talking for at least a little bit. Who to contact if you want to talk more details. So like I said, we're happy to do lots of conversations about this, but I don't know if you're interested in talking about it if you don't tell us that you're interested in talking about it, right? So if you want to talk more details about any specific area, your group or yourself, whoever, if you want to talk, please send me an email. Include, if you could, what do you want to talk about, and when you'd like to talk about it. And if you have a community event that's going on, or you have an event that you'd like to invite us to, we'd be happy to attend if we can make it. Please contact Alexa. You can see her contact information there, details for your event, and who we should contact for that as well. So with that, what questions do we have? I'll stop sharing for just a second, and I'm going to look through the chat. There's been a fair bit of questions, I think. So why don't we start there? And then if folks want to raise their hands, and we'll sort of, there's a little raise hand feature, I think under, I thought there was. Yes, under the React button in Zoom, you can click that. There's a button to raise your hand. We'll get to your questions in order then. So Nahid mentions their federal standards. So talking about MnDOT. Yeah, I know. Transportation, I know, is a big question here, and I think we're certainly trying to accommodate that as we can. Nahid, you might be interested in particular too. There is a bill that's going forward with the legislature, or as at least proposed. I'm not sure, but there's a bill talking about cumulative impacts from transportation with a MnDOT focus in particular. So you may already know about that, but in case you didn't, that might be something in particular. I know I appreciate that you continue to come to these and advocate for transportation. I notice, and so you might find that one particularly interesting as well. Leslie asks, what solutions, or what are solutions do you have to curb the impacts that affect our health? When will they be implemented into our communities? Leslie, I'm not sure I understand your question. If you wanted to, maybe I'm just misreading
I
it,
don't
but
I don't know if you can hear me.
I
Can
can.
you?
Yep.
Okay. So my question basically is, we're looking at all these impacts. We know these impacts. These impacts have not gone away. They've gotten worse over time, and more have accumulated. So my question is, while we look at them, are we looking at solutions in our mind? Like, okay, we know that because of the way that the floods are, it affects our soil, and what can we do to retain the soil from going into our water banks? Okay. And so my thing would be, while you're looking at these impacts, are you looking at solutions to implement them? Or is it just, we're just looking at the impacts and then we'll come back later and look at solutions to curb the impacts? In the meantime, we're still being impacted. So I'm just wondering, is there a plan at the end of the rainbow of this project and this report out to implement solutions to the impacts that are affecting our communities?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think that's part of what this program is trying to accomplish, is a little bit of both. Trying to figure out what do we want to look at, and then how can we address that moving forward. So, this analysis it isn't necessarily just a, here's the collection of things to look at, and now I've looked at them. It is also, what is the impact, and what might be done as to address that impact. So
Yep.
Go ahead.
Being there working with you and the team when I did my internship, and how you guys were all into solution basis, and that's where it's basically driven me, and learning how to
Yeah.
speak in layman's terms. But I'm more solution driven than anything, having an opportunity to be in working with you and the others at the PCA. So yeah, thank you for
Yeah.
that.
Thanks,
So I'm always
Leslie.
looking for solutions.
Absolutely. No, that's helpful. And if you see ways to do that, feel free, send us those comments. Let us know. Um, Jenny asks, assuming we're keeping the tool supplemented and updated with state data to avoid any disruptions to federal databases no longer being publicly available or reliable. Yes, yeah, that's going to be part of this, is any data that ends up in that tool. We're thinking about, how likely is this to continue being available, or, if that changes over time, we'll kind of have to address that, certainly. But I know that's something we're thinking about, and if there's any folks from the data team that are working on that and want to add on to it, go for it. But I think in general, yes, it's a relevant issue that we're trying to keep in mind. Nahid asks, can you include impacts on watersheds and the Mississippi River, including the Mississippi National River and Recreation Area, part of National Parks area? Yeah, I think that's kind of some, like, what we're thinking about with the different indicators of, like, if and I think I saw this a little later about impaired waters. That's one way we can look at it. But I think it's a good suggestion. It's something certainly we can think about more too. Evan asks, how are we thinking about defining substantial? Evan, was there something more? I know I think that I saw that question come up a little earlier before I got to that slide. Did that answer your question, or were you looking for something else?
Something else. Like, I mean, specifically, what are you thinking right now? Like, substantial is more than what?
Yeah, we're still working on that idea in particular. So I don't have too much specifics to think about, but I know, like, again, we have examples elsewhere that we're looking at, as far as um, how do other places do something like that. New Jersey in their rule talks a little bit about um, part of their analysis is the facility demonstrating that there is or isn't that impact some way. And if that's not demonstrated, then it's assumed there is a substantial impact. So beyond, as far as that being out there as an example, we're still thinking about exactly how we would do that. Leslie asks, will you create new jobs for community to work in where you see the impacts to help curb them? Yeah, that's potentially something. I think that's an idea too, that maybe that's part of, maybe that question came out as from the community benefit agreement. That could potentially be something that's part of that, maybe. This is also work that as we continue to figure out what we want to do, maybe this is something PCA does, but we'll find out. Stacy says, please include more water factors than just impaired waters, as the 303D list doesn't include all impaired waters, but only those that have had sufficient data collection to document their impairment. Yeah, Stacy, sounds like you have some background there too. If you have specific suggestions, again, we're all ears. Please let us know. Nahid asks, and it looks like there's a conversation here. Or maybe that came earlier. Oh, okay, that's when it edited it, it brought it down. Oh, and Alex, perfect. Alex did include here, there's a cumulative impacts law for MnDOT, like the one I mentioned. So yes, that's the bill. Thanks for the kind words, Leslie. Evan mentions the coalition of groups, Frontline Community Protection Coalition, focused on advocating for an effective rule. Why are we waiting until May to do the notice of intent to adopt? Because that's the deadline that we have for the legislature, and there's a lot to figure out to get there, which is the simple answer. We're not waiting until May. We need until May to get all of the rules in order and the I's dotted and the T's crossed. Nahid mentions one of the benefits that are argued for a project by cities are claims of reduction of property taxes. The facts about whether property taxes actually will be reduced needs to be examined and shared. Yeah, so yeah, there's a whole bunch of stuff that's going to go into that community benefit agreement. And part of it is it's not just the statute contemplates not just the economic impact. So thinking about the other factors as well. So it's certainly not going to be just an economic consideration, but there would be other factors that would go into that as well. Kara, or go ahead. Yeah.
This is Roxanne. We were the original
Yeah.
advocates of this bill and wrote a lot of it, if not the majority. We also worked on the advocacy and lobbying of this bill, and I'm kind of frustrated as usual with the MPCA because I think, and I don't really get a chance to talk to you all that much because I'm out here working so damn hard, but we do what we can and then we move around. But I think you guys did just give us a $50,000 grant or up to it to build this solar hub, and we did that. We completed that. We also are working on air monitoring now because we wrote a bill that we passed at the state so that the MPCA can do air monitoring work and give that out to communities. And we applied for that. We didn't even get that. And not that we were supposed to get it, but I just think that this is the frustrating part of being a Black woman out here doing this work on the front lines, having to deal with all the other BS, right? Within the system, the community, the government. We're on the front lines and we're not getting the funding. And you guys don't even invite us to like through all the meetings that you had, you didn't even once think, maybe we should invite the Black women who've been leading this fight. You know, I'm one of the leaders of getting a whole pollution facility out of my neighborhood. It doesn't make any sense. If you guys want to do better, community relations, invest in the leadership and the work of the people who are out here doing the work. I don't know how much you guys got for this cumulative impact. I heard somewhere around the amount $300 million. So I could be wrong. But again, you're benefiting off of Black women's work. When do you guys reach out and say, hey, you know what? You've been doing such great work. Maybe we should contract you to do the work, to continue to do the work that you've been doing. Maybe we should contact you and ask you what you were thinking when you were doing this work. But you guys just keep going on with business as usual. Everybody does that to us. So I'm just kind of frustrated. And I really wasn't supposed to be here at this meeting. I got other things to do too, but I actually just gave up a therapy appointment to be here because, I'm like, maybe I should just come because you guys just keep moving on with business as usual. So we've also invited you to give you an EJ tour to, educate you a little bit because it's hard to be on these workshops where you're just sitting here listening to people, continue on the work without us when you should be working with us because we're doing the work for you and you're reaping the benefits. So I hope you guys reach out and start changing the way that I don't know what everybody else is saying because I'm not coming to these meetings, but I've been here from the beginning and I'm still here. So reach out. And I will, I did talk to Bennett. So I heard that you guys are maybe working on coming out and doing an EJ tour with us. But yeah, we'd like to talk to you, all of you. And that's, you know, I guess that's all I'll say because I was kind of long-winded. But as far as the tree stuff, though, we're not interested in letting people continue to like plant trees after they already targeted our areas to remove trees while they made millions of dollars, ripped off a bunch of Black people, and then turned around and want to tell us that they want to plant some more trees in order to like, offset the amount of pollution that they're over polluting us with. Come on, we have some thoughts if you guys would listen. And also, we don't want to do this work for free while you guys reap the benefits. So that's all I have to say. Thanks for the meeting.
Yeah, thanks Roxanne for sharing your thoughts there. Absolutely. I'm happy to talk. We'll figure it out. Okay, I know we're close to done. Okay, and in the chat, Kara mentions speak more about where the motivation for the data app with the set number of indicators came from. What will it be used for in what part of the rulemaking process? So part of the statutes require the MPCA to make publicly available the data that would be used as part of the cumulative impacts analysis. So that data app is part of that, to have that central sort of area where data that would go into this analysis is available. And so this could be used both in helping us answer who needs to do the analysis, as well as what do they look at as part of the analysis? What are the impacts that they're going to have on that different type, those different data sets, the different things that those are looking at? And then sort of a follow-up, not as familiar with the CBAs, was wondering, do CBAs make people think or feel that harm is more allowable instead of putting prevention of more harm first because you're making up for the harm by providing community benefits? Yeah, I think that idea. I think we've certainly heard that as well. Is like this is kind of and kind of meshes with the things that Roxanne was just saying about this is kind of the what happens after. So I think that idea that you're sharing there is certainly not an individual idea. I think other people have expressed that as well. Lori asks, how might communities leverage this process during discussions of current proposals for amendments to air quality permits prior to this rule being finalized? Yeah, so Lori, we don't, obviously these rules aren't finalized. So it's not like there's something that could be pointed to right now. I think it's a reasonable question to ask, like, what are the things to think about? Does this coming up does this impact what we look at now? I think it's a fair question to ask, but I don't know. I can't speak to how this might affect current proposals for air permits. Bridget asked for contact information that was shared. Great, thanks Maggie for doing that. Couple people in chat thanking Roxanne for her work and speaking up. Stacy followed up to my question. Great. Thank you, Stacy. Great. And then Kara, to your last question about looking at the other CBA type models, what have you found about how other places make decisions for how much money is enough for the CBA? We're not there yet. I don't have an answer for that question in particular. That's something that I mentioned we're still thinking about. So something to think about as we go forward. So I know we're at time. If you have to go, please feel free. If there's a last minute burning question or comment, I'm happy to hang out and answer those questions. All right. Otherwise, if not, we'll take a copy of everything that's been included in the chat so far. Ooh, thanks, Nahid. Yeah, send me the details on that. That would be interesting. We'll post, like we mentioned, we'll post a copy of the recording to the webpage. But otherwise, that's it for now. Thanks everybody for attending. Thanks for taking time out of your day to be here.